Right, let's drill into this a little more. After the August 2012 Marikana massacre, in which 34 miners were killed by police, and the Commission of Inquiry was established, a panel was created to come up with recommendations into the rules for police when dealing with the public and protests. And I'm joined now by David Bruce, a researcher specializing in policing and public security. He was also part of the panel that released that report. David, thank you very much for your time. So in terms of what the police minister released today, are those the recommendations that the panel came up with, or have they been altered?
No, that's what's been released today is the report of the panel, which was completed in 2018. So it's finally seen the light of day at the end of March 2021.
Why has it taken so long?
Well, that's not entirely clear, but you know, the way in which I would understand it is that there isn't really a commitment to engagement with the kind of policy issues which face police in South Africa. So I mean, that would be my short answer.
So what clarity do we now have on what procedures police need to follow when facing crowds who may or may not be threatening violence? Because when you and I spoke, I think it was last week, you were saying it wasn't clear what the framework was. Do we now have a framework?
Well, what we have is a report, and what we've also have is a commitment from the Minister and the National Commissioner that they are taking seriously the issue of introducing standards relating to the use of rubber bullets. The more general issue that this speaks to is specifically the issue of how police conduct themselves in relation to members of a crowd. And what needs to be recognized here is that typically when you have a situation of crowd violence, it's not all of the members of the crowd who are involved in violence. It's quite frequently, it's a limited number of individuals within that crowd who are involved in violence of one kind or another. And so the one critical issue here is that what the report calls for is a move to what's called implementation of a principle of differentiation, where the police focus any force which they may use on people who are involved in violence, rather than following this approach in terms of which it's regarded as acceptable to unleash force such as rubber bullets generally against members of the public who kind of present in that situation.
So am I understanding you correctly that it would be about isolating those individuals within the crowd that might be becoming violent and then dealing with them specifically?
Yes, so that's right. So you know, and what the police need to begin to appreciate is that when they use force in the way which they typically do at the moment, which is to sort of with this kind of idea that one's dispersing the crowd as a whole. What one then does is creates a great deal of antagonism against the police by people who weren't necessarily hostile to the police in the first place. So it's actually something that can be productive for the police if they do.
And that sounds to me like the very first steps in any plan would be communication, perhaps speaking to the leaders of a group of people who are protesting and saying, look, please, can you deal with certain members who are getting out of control? And I suppose what I'm trying to get an understanding of is there a blueprint of what you can and cannot do? Because when it comes to telling the police or training the police in how they need to deal with a crowd, it seems there is much misunderstanding. Also, police are hampered by ineffective equipment, and we hear the police minister saying so much has been spent on training and resources for public order policing, but it seems generally the police don't have the right equipment, and they certainly don't have, it seems, a standard way of procedure. Is there a bullet point, list by list, on what you do if things are getting out of control, in terms of public warnings, loud hailer warnings, speaking to the leaders of a protest? Give us some idea of what the right way to proceed looks.
Well, you see, I mean, some of this is actually in place already. So, for instance, the idea of negotiated crowd management is actually part of the existing framework. And it's more a question of where, negotiated management is not quite delivering the results that you want from it, that these other questions to do with the use of force and issues of differentiation come in. But yes, for instance, the report now does put forward a crowd management doctrine for the police, which sets forward, puts forward a list of 4 or 5 core principles that they need to apply.
And the police minister, the police minister still wants rubber bullets to be part of that. Yes.
Sorry, we're missing each other, but it partly builds on what is already in place. So it isn't something that's entirely new, but it's kind of refining the existing framework.
The police minister says rubber bullets are still going to be part of the crowd control options. Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, it sounds like a slightly unpopular thing to say right at the moment, but yes, I do think they are necessary. I think in order to, they are one of the types of weapons which can, in principle, be directed at individual targets, while many of the other crowd control weapons are inherently indiscriminate in nature. The one problem, though, that we have is that we have the projectiles that are used are multiple projectile ammunition, which is in fact intended to be fired in an indiscriminate manner at members of a crowd. So preferably what we do to support implementation of a new crowd management doctrine is also introduce more accurate, safer projectiles for use by police.
Andrew Statani, Nathaniel Julies, Mtokozizi and Tumba, when is that going to stop? These are people who were not involved in doing anything wrong, who were either protesting lawfully or bystanders or walking down the street to get biscuits. If there are frameworks in place, if we have rules, where is it going wrong and how quickly can it change?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think it is important for us to talk about the one death in particular is that of Andries Titane. Which is going to be, we're going to be marking the 10th anniversary of that death in 2 weeks' time. In fact, it's not entirely true to say that he was not involved in any violence of any kind. What is true to say is that the police response to his actions was completely disproportionate. It involved the use of rubber bullets in a manner in which they were likely to be fatal, and which in a situation where it was unnecessary to use rubber bullets in that manner. So, hopefully, if we did have a more clearly defined regulatory framework and compliance by police with that framework, we would be able to avoid deaths such as that of Andries Titane, and definitely the deaths of people who were kind of innocent bystanders or people who were completely uninvolved in violent conduct of any kind.
That phrase, the disproportionate use of force, I think sums up the problem that we seem to be facing within the police. What's at the heart of that?
Well, you see, it's partly simply that the risks involved in the use of weapons such as rubber bullets have not been properly acknowledged and understood, and there's an attitude within the police that sees them as almost fairly harmless. The consequences of their use as fairly harmless, and one of the things that is now increasingly getting recognition at last is that these are potentially lethal weapons.
Thank you very much, David Bruce, a researcher specializing in policing and public security. Now